November 1940. A chill wind swept across the Mediterranean, but it wasn't the weather that kept Admiral Andrew Cunningham awake. It was a nightmare of steel and shallow water, a strategic paralysis that threatened to choke Britain's lifeline. 6 Italian battleships, symbols of Mussolini's power, lay cradled in Taranto Harbor, not by chance but by design, protected by geography itself. The water was a mere 42 feet deep, an insurmountable barrier that rendered conventional torpedo attacks a suicide mission. Every naval manual, every cold, hard physics calculation screamed the same brutal truth: drop a torpedo, and it would bury itself in the mud like an expensive lawn dart. The Italians knew this. They'd done the math. These leviathans, the Vittorio, Veneto, and Conte di Cavour, represented nearly half of Italy's capital ship strength locked behind an invisible wall of impossibility. British intelligence painted a grim picture. Pilots would have to fly within 3,000 yards, a mile and a half, for any hope of a shallow enough drop. At that range, lumbering swordfish biplanes, barely capable of 90 miles per hour with a torpedo, would be shredded by Italian anti-aircraft fire. The strategic situation was desperate. Britain stood alone against the Axis, and the Mediterranean was everything. Control of oil supply routes, the entire southern flank of Europe. Losing it meant strangulation. Those 6 battleships weren't just ships, they were a cork in the bottle, and Cunningham needed them gone. Traditional warfare offered no answer. His battleships were spread thin. His carrier-based torpedo bombers faced an unyielding law of physics. Attacking from a safer 6,000 yards meant an even deeper dive for the torpedoes, turning difficult into impossible. Or so everyone thought. Because as despair settled over the Admiralty 300 miles away in a cramped oil-stained workshop, a lone commander named Freddy Willoughby was about to shatter the rules. He was proving that sometimes the line between impossible and inevitable isn't drawn by physics, but by one stubborn mechanic who refuses to read the manual. Get ready, because this is the untold story of how one man's audacious defiance didn't just change a battle, but reshaped the course of World War II. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this incredible tale of ingenuity and courage. The Mark XII torpedo was a beautiful piece of engineering and a mathematical nightmare rolled into one. 18 feet long, weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, it was packed with explosives and powered by a compressed air engine that could push it through water at 40 knots. On paper, it was devastatingly effective. In practice, it had one fatal flaw that every navy in the world understood: physics didn't negotiate. When you drop a torpedo from an aircraft, it doesn't just slip into the water and start swimming toward its target like a well-trained dolphin. The entry is violent. The torpedo hits the surface at whatever speed your aircraft was traveling, usually around 90 miles per hour for a swordfish, plus the downward velocity from gravity. That's roughly 132 feet per second of forward momentum combined with the drop speed. The weapon penetrates the water's surface and keeps going down, driven by all that kinetic energy. The nose wants to dive, gravity wants to pull. Water resistance tries to slow everything down but can't overcome the initial momentum fast enough. Standard doctrine said a Mark XII dropped from the required altitude of 150 feet would plunge to a depth of 60 feet before its internal gyroscope and hydrostatic controls could level it out and bring it back up to its running depth of about 12 feet below the surface. 60 feet in water that was only 42 feet deep at Taranto. You weren't attacking battleships. You were ploughing the harbour floor. The math was unforgiving. Some British engineers had proposed dropping from lower altitudes, maybe 75 feet instead of 150. But at 75 feet, you gave Italian gunners more time to track your slow-moving biplane. You also risked clipping the water with your landing gear or stalling out if you hit turbulence. And even at 75 feet, the torpedo still dove too deep for Taranto's shallow basin. The swordfish would need to drop from practically wave-top height, maybe 30 feet, which meant flying straight and level through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire with zero room for evasive maneuvers. There was another problem that most people forget when they talk about torpedo attacks: distance. The closer you were to your target when you released, the less depth your torpedo needed to dive before it started its run. But there's a catch. Torpedoes didn't arm themselves instantly. The Mark XII had a propeller on its nose, not for propulsion but for arming. That propeller needed to spin roughly 350 yards through the water before the firing mechanism was fully armed. Drop too close and you'd score a perfect hit with a weapon that wouldn't detonate. It would just bounce off the enemy hull like a very expensive rubber ball. So you needed to be far enough away for the torpedo to arm itself. Call it 400 yards minimum to be safe. But you also needed to be close enough that the torpedo didn't dive too deep during entry, which meant being within 3000 yards at most for any hope of success in shallow water. That gave you a narrow attack corridor between 400 and 3000 yards where the physics might work in your favour. The Royal Navy had tested these parameters exhaustively. The torpedo development facility at HMS Vernon had run the calculations dozens of times. The conclusion was always the same: attacking capital ships in water shallower than 50 feet was possible, only if you were willing to accept catastrophic losses. 70% casualties minimum, probably higher, the kind of numbers that made admirals write letters to grieving families for months afterward. Commander Frederick Charles William Willoughby didn't look like someone who would rewrite naval warfare. He looked like someone who belonged in a garage, which made sense, because that's where he spent most of his time. The son of a shipyard worker from Portsmouth, Willoughby had joined the Royal Navy as an enlisted mechanic in 1922, working his way up through the ranks by being the guy who could fix anything that broke. By 1938, he'd earned a commission and found himself assigned to the torpedo development section at HMS Vernon, the Navy's weapons research facility near Portsmouth Harbor. Most officers treated torpedo development as a stepping stone to command positions at sea. Willoughby treated it like a personal puzzle that offended him by existing. He had this mechanic's intuition that said, if something didn't work, you didn't accept it. You changed it. The problem was that the Royal Navy in 1939 didn't particularly want mavericks changing things. They wanted officers who followed the manual, respected the chain of command, and understood that weapon systems were designed by committees of brilliant engineers who'd already thought of everything. Willoughby started his experiments in early 1940, right around the time Norway fell, and France started collapsing. He'd been reading reports about the need to attack enemy harbours, and the shallow water problem kept appearing like a recurring nightmare. The official position was clear: shallow harbours require different weapons. Maybe mines dropped from aircraft, maybe special assault teams. Torpedoes just couldn't do the job, but Willoughby kept thinking about entry angle. If the torpedo dove 60 feet because it was heavy and fast and had nothing to slow it down, what if you made it less heavy or less fast, or gave it something to slow it down? He started with ballast experiments, adding weight to the tail section to see if he could change the entry angle. The torpedoes still dove too deep. He tried adjusting the gyroscope settings, thinking maybe he could force the nose up earlier. The torpedoes porpoised wildly and lost their targeting accuracy. He experimented with release speeds, convincing test pilots to fly slower on their approach runs. The torpedoes improved slightly, but still dove past 40 feet. Then Willoughby did something that would have gotten him laughed out of any engineering conference. He went to a carpenter's shop and asked them to cut him some wooden fins. Not metal, not some advanced alloy plain ash wood, the same stuff they made cricket bats from. His thinking was almost childishly simple. What if you attached wooden fins to the nose and tail of the torpedo? The wood would hit the water first, create drag, slow the entry, maybe change the angle just enough to keep the weapon shallow. The Royal Navy's torpedo establishment told him it wouldn't work. Wood would shatter on impact. Even if it didn't shatter, it would create unpredictable drag that would throw off the torpedo's course. Even if the course stayed true, the fins would never detach properly and would interfere with the weapon's hydrodynamics. Willoughby nodded politely and built the fins anyway. His first test was in March 1,940 inches, a cordoned-off section of Portsmouth Harbor, where the water depth was similar to Taranto. He convinced a swordfish pilot to drop a wooden fin torpedo from 150 feet. The torpedo hit the water, dove down, and the wooden fins snapped off cleanly, just as Willoughby had calculated. The weapon leveled out at 38 feet. Not perfect, but survivable. In 42 feet of water, that torpedo would have cleared the bottom with room to spare. The establishment's response was about what you'd expect. Interesting experiment, Commander, but hardly practical for combat conditions. Wood varies in density. Salt water degrades it unpredictably, and even if it worked, you'd need to handcraft fins for every torpedo, which wasn't feasible for large-scale operations. Willoughby went back to his workshop. He'd proven the concept worked. Now he just needed to make it work better. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: cardboard, and a magnetic detonator that most people had forgotten existed. Willoughby realized that wooden fins solved half the problem. They slowed the torpedo's dive, but they were inconsistent. Ashwood varied in density depending on where it was harvested, how it was dried, even which part of the tree it came from. One batch of fins might perform perfectly. The next batch might shatter or create too much drag. He needed something more uniform, more predictable. Enter Hellis Shaw clutch plates and breakaway tail fins. Willoughby designed a drum-shaped nose attachment made from layers of compressed cardboard reinforced with fabric, essentially a collapsible air brake that would sit over the torpedo's nose cone. Behind it he added wooden fins to the tail section, but these were lighter shaped, more like stabilizers than drag anchors. The theory was elegant. The cardboard nose drum would create massive initial drag when it hit the water, bleeding off energy and forcing a shallower entry angle. Once the torpedo was in the water and slowing down, breakaway wires would release both the nose drum and the tail fins. The whole assembly would fall away, leaving a clean torpedo running true toward its target. Testing in April and May of 1940 showed the modification worked even better than predicted. A swordfish could now drop from 150 feet at 90 miles per hour, and the modified torpedo would dive to only 30 feet before leveling out. In water 42 feet deep, that gave you 12 feet of clearance. Not comfortable, but workable. More importantly, the modification was cheap and quick. A workshop crew could attach the nose, drum and tail fins to a standard Mark XII in about 45 minutes. But Willoughby added one more element that pushed his modification from clever to revolutionary: the duplex magnetic pistol. This was an alternative detonator that had been developed in the late 1930s, but rarely used, because it was considered unreliable. Instead of exploding on contact when it hit a ship's hull, the magnetic pistol was designed to sense the magnetic field of a steel ship passing overhead. When the torpedo ran underneath a target, the pistol would detect the field change and detonate the warhead directly below the keel, the weakest part of any warship. Most navies avoided magnetic detonators because they had a nasty habit of exploding prematurely, or not at all. Earth's magnetic field varied by location. Temperature affected sensitivity. A torpedo with a magnetic detonator might go off 50 yards too early, or it might run right under a battleship and keep going until it ran out of fuel. But Willoughby realized something crucial. If you were attacking in shallow water with modified torpedoes that ran at shallow depths, a magnetic detonator became dramatically more reliable. The torpedo would pass directly under the ship's keel at maybe 15 feet depth. At that range, the magnetic signal was strong, clear, and unmistakable. He conducted tests in late May 1940 using decommissioned hulls anchored in shallow water. Modified torpedoes with duplex pistols achieved an 87% detonation rate when running at depths between 12 and 18 feet. Contact detonators on conventional torpedoes were hitting maybe 60% in combat conditions because they often hit at bad angles or struck reinforced armor belts. An 87% rate was extraordinary. By June 1940, Willoughby had a complete package: wooden tail fins and cardboard nose drums that allowed shallow water drops, combined with magnetic detonators that maximized damage when the torpedoes reached their targets. On paper, his modifications would allow swordfish bombers to attack from 6,000 yards instead of 3,000, dropping from safe altitudes in water as shallow as 35 feet. The modified torpedoes would run true detonate under the keel and crack enemy battleships open like eggs. He submitted his findings to the Admiralty in July 1940. Their response arrived 3 weeks later, and it wasn't what he'd hoped for. The Admiralty's response was professionally worded but unmistakably clear. Unauthorized weapon modifications were forbidden. The letter dated August 3, 1940, explained that while Commander Willoughby's experiment showed interesting potential field modifications to naval ordnance, required extensive testing protocols, formal approval from the Delhi Ordnance Board and certification that the changes wouldn't endanger British personnel. The magnetic duplex pistol remained classified as experimental and unreliable for combat deployment. Using it in operational conditions without explicit authorization could result in disciplinary action, possibly court-martial. The reasoning wasn't entirely bureaucratic paranoia. The Royal Navy had legitimate concerns. Magnetic detonators had already caused problems for the German Kriegsmarine. Their G7E torpedoes were failing spectacularly during the Norway campaign because the magnetic pistols kept detonating prematurely, or not at all. British submarines had experienced similar failures with their own magnetic exploders. The technology was temperamental, and when a magnetic detonator failed, it didn't just mean a missed target. It meant your submarine or aircraft had revealed its position for nothing, alerting every enemy ship in the area. There was another issue. The wooden fins and cardboard drums were from a certain perspective absurd. The Royal Navy prided itself on precision engineering. Torpedoes were sophisticated machines built to exacting tolerances in specialized facilities. The idea that you could improve them by strapping on wooden bits that looked like they came from a high school shop class was professionally insulting to the engineers who'd spent years developing the Mark XII. It suggested that complex problems could be solved with simple solutions which undermined the entire expert establishment. Willoughby understood the politics, but he also understood something else Britain was losing. France had surrendered in June. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities. U-boats were strangling Atlantic supply lines. The Mediterranean was effectively an Italian lake. And those 6 battleships sitting in Taranto represented a fleet in being that tied down massive British naval resources. Every day those ships survived was another day. Britain had to maintain heavy forces in the Mediterranean instead of protecting convoys or preparing for the inevitable German invasion attempt. He went around the official channels. In September 1940, he contacted Rear Admiral Lumley Lister, who commanded the aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean fleet. Lister was planning something ambitious, a carrier-based night torpedo attack on Taranto Harbor, inspired by a similar operation the Royal Navy had wargamed back in 1938. The problem was the same one everyone kept hitting. The physics didn't work. Swordfish would have to fly into point-blank range to have any hope of success, and losses would be catastrophic. Willoughby sent Lister everything. Test results, photographs of recovered torpedoes, mathematical models showing the improved entry angles data on the duplex pistol's performance in shallow water. He included a handwritten note that essentially said, if the Navy wanted to attack Taranto successfully, his modifications weren't optional. They were necessary. Lister was the right kind of officer for this moment. He'd risen through naval aviation at a time when the battleship admirals still treated aircraft carriers as floating scouts rather than capital ships. He understood that sometimes you had to break rules to win wars. In early October, Lister met with Admiral Cunningham, the Mediterranean Fleet commander, and made his case. Authorize the modifications, give Willoughby permission to prepare modified torpedoes, and the Taranto attack could happen before winter weather closed the operational window. Cunningham faced an impossible choice: approve unauthorized weapon modifications, and he'd be responsible if they failed catastrophically, possibly killing dozens of aircrews. Deny the modifications and the Taranto attack would probably fail anyway, or never happen at all. On October 8, 1940, Cunningham made his decision. He sent a coded message to the Admiralty, informing them, not asking them, that he was authorizing field modifications to 30 torpedoes for specialized shallow water operations. He didn't mention Willoughby by name. He didn't detail the modifications. He simply stated that operational necessity required deviation from standard protocols. The Admiralty's reply was a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity. Your discretion noted. Assume full operational responsibility for consequences. Translation: if this works, we'll take the credit. If it fails, you're on your own. Willoughby had exactly 3 weeks to prepare 21 modified torpedoes and train the aircrews on the new attack parameters. The banned trick was about to get its battlefield test. November 11, 1940. 21 Fairy Swordfish biplanes lifted off from HMS Illustrious in 2 waves, their engines clattering into the Mediterranean night. Each aircraft carried either a modified torpedo with Willoughby's wooden fins and cardboard drums or flares and bombs for the aircraft assigned to suppression duties. The first wave launched at 8:40 p.m., the second followed 2 hours later. The moon was nearly full, which meant perfect visibility for the attackers, but also perfect visibility for Italian gunners. It was the kind of tactical compromise that gave commanders ulcers. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson led the first wave 12 aircraft total. His navigation was flawless. The Swordfish approached Taranto from the northwest using cloud cover until the last possible moment, then descended to attack altitude. The plan was brutally simple. Flare droppers would illuminate the harbour from the eastern side, drawing Italian attention and anti-aircraft fire. While the gunners focused on the flare aircraft, the torpedo bombers would come in from the southwest at 8,000 yards, more than twice the normal attack distance, and release their modified weapons. At 10:58 p.m., the first flares ignited over Taranto Harbor, turning night into day. Italian searchlights stabbed upward, tracking the slow-moving biplanes. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with tracer rounds and exploding shells. The noise was apocalyptic. Hundreds of guns firing simultaneously, the crack of aerial explosions, the deeper boom of heavy coastal batteries. The Italians had prepared for exactly this scenario. They had 101 anti-aircraft guns positioned around the harbour, plus the combined firepower of 6 battleships, multiple cruisers, and destroyer escorts. It was the most heavily defended harbour in the Mediterranean, but the Italian gunners had prepared for conventional attacks. They'd zeroed their weapons for ranges between 2,000 and 3,500 yards. The distances British torpedo bombers would need to close to for standard drops. When Williamson's aircraft began their runs at 8,000 yards, the gunners had to completely readjust their calculations. 8,000 yards was a distance for horizontal bombers, not torpedo planes. The adjustment took precious seconds, and in those seconds the modified torpedoes were already in the water. Williamson went in first, his Swordfish dropping to 150 feet as he lined up on the battleship Conte di Cavour. His observer released the torpedo at 8,200 yards, a distance that would have been suicide with conventional weapons. The modified Mark XII hit the water. The cardboard nose drum collapsed on impact, creating massive drag. The wooden tail fin stabilized the entry angle, and the weapon dove to exactly 32 feet before leveling out. It ran straight and true, its duplex magnetic pistol armed and sensitive. When the torpedo passed beneath Conte di Cavour's keel, the magnetic field triggered the detonator. The explosion ripped open the bottom of the ship, flooding 3 compartments instantly. The battleship settled onto the harbour bottom within minutes, her back broken. Lieutenant Neil Kemp attacked next, targeting the new battleship Littorio. His torpedo ran at the same shallow depth Willoughby had promised. Another magnetic detonation beneath the keel. Littorio took the hit forward, flooding her bow and knocking out her main armament systems. She stayed afloat but was effectively out of action. The attack pattern continued. Aircraft coming in from unexpected ranges, releasing torpedoes that shouldn't work in shallow water but somehow did. Magnetic detonations cracking open hulls in the places battleships were most vulnerable. The second wave arrived just after midnight, led by Lieutenant Commander John Hale. By now, the Italian gunners had adjusted their tactics, and the defensive fire was more accurate. 2 Swordfish were shot down, but the modified torpedoes kept performing. Littorio took 2 more hits from the second wave, including one that detonated directly beneath her fuel bunkers. The battleship Caio Duilio absorbed a single torpedo that opened a 40-foot gash in her hull below the waterline. By 1230 a.m. on November 12th it was over. The Swordfish that survived formed up and flew back toward Illustrious. Behind them, Taranto Harbor was chaos. 3 battleships were sinking or crippled. 2 more had sustained damage. Oil fires burned on the water's surface. Italian damage control teams were struggling to assess what had happened. The entire attack had lasted roughly 12 minutes of actual combat time. The butcher's bill for the Royal Navy: 2 swordfish lost, 2 aircrew killed, 2 captured. For that cost, the fleet air arm had crippled half of Italy's battle fleet and fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Admiral Cunningham sent a brief message to the Admiralty Taranto, achieved modifications effective. Willoughby's methods validated. One mechanic's band trick had just changed the war. On the morning of November 12, 1940, a Japanese naval attaché in Rome, named Commander Takeshi Nito, sent an urgent encrypted cable to Tokyo. The message was brief. British achieved impossible at Taranto. Shallow water attack successful, require immediate intelligence on methods. Within 48 hours, Japanese naval intelligence had collected every available report, photograph, and rumor about the attack. What they learned would reshape their own war plans in ways the British never anticipated. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been wrestling with a strategic problem remarkably similar to the one that had plagued the Royal Navy. If war came between Japan and the United States by late 1940, it seemed increasingly inevitable. The Japanese combined fleet would need to neutralize the American Pacific Fleet quickly. That fleet was based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and Pearl Harbor had the same geographic advantage Taranto had enjoyed: shallow water. The harbor averaged about 45 feet deep in most anchorages, with some areas even shallower. American planners assumed this made Pearl Harbor effectively immune to torpedo attack. Yamamoto didn't believe in immunity. He believed in adaptation. Throughout 1941, Japanese intelligence officers pieced together what had happened at Taranto. They interviewed Italian naval officers. They studied British training manuals that had been captured or leaked. They analyzed reconnaissance photographs of damaged Italian battleships. Most importantly, they learned about modifications to torpedo drop parameters, wooden stabilizing fins, altered entry angles, shallow running weapons that somehow worked in water depths everyone said were impossible. The Japanese didn't copy Willoughby's design exactly because they didn't have complete specifications. What they had was proof of concept, the idea that torpedoes could be modified to work in shallow harbors. Japanese engineers at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal began their own experiments in February 1941. They took their Type 91 aerial torpedo, already one of the most sophisticated in the world, and started testing modifications. Instead of wooden fins, they used breakaway wooden stabilizers that fit around the tail assembly. Instead of cardboard nose drums, they developed wooden anti-roll fins that would snap off after water entry. The Japanese had one advantage. Willoughby hadn't time. They had nearly a full year to refine their modifications before they'd need to use them in combat. By September 1941, they'd perfected a system where Type 91 torpedoes could be dropped from altitudes as low as 40 feet in water, as shallow as 42 feet. The weapons would dive to approximately 35 feet level out and run true to their targets. The Japanese didn't use magnetic detonators like the British duplex. They'd tested magnetic pistols and found them unreliable, but their contact detonators were good enough when you could guarantee the torpedo would hit the target. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the Pearl Harbor attack, studied the Taranto operation obsessively. He obtained translated copies of British after-action reports through intelligence channels. He noted the attack timing, just before midnight when crews were at minimal readiness. He noted the use of multiple waves to overwhelm defenses. He noted particularly the extended release ranges made possible by shallow water torpedo modifications. At Taranto, British aircraft had released from 8,000 yards. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft would be able to release from similar or even greater distances, giving them precious extra seconds to evade American anti-aircraft fire. The parallels between Taranto and Pearl Harbor are almost eerie when you line them up side by side. Both attacks targeted battleships in shallow harbors on a weekend. Both used carrier-based aircraft launching in multiple waves. Both relied on modified torpedoes that conventional wisdom said wouldn't work. Both achieved strategic surprise despite the defenders having advanced warning that attacks were possible. The primary difference was scale. Taranto involved 21 aircraft attacking 6 battleships, while Pearl Harbor involved 183 aircraft in the first wave alone, attacking 8 battleships plus numerous other vessels. On December 7, 1941, at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, the first wave of Japanese aircraft reached Pearl Harbor. 40 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers carried modified Type 91 torpedoes with wooden stabilizing fins. They approached from multiple directions at altitudes between 40 and 100 feet, released their weapons at ranges between 6,000 and 9,000 yards, and watched those weapons run shallow and true in water that American naval architects had sworn was too shallow for torpedo attacks. USS Oklahoma took 3 torpedo hits in the first 10 minutes and capsized. USS West Virginia absorbed 6 torpedoes and settled onto the harbor bottom. USS California took 2 torpedo hits that flooded her machinery spaces. The battleship Arizona would be destroyed by bombs rather than torpedoes, but the other capital ships that died or were crippled that morning fell victim to the same principle Willoughby had proven in a Portsmouth workshop 18 months earlier. Shallow water wasn't immunity if you were willing to modify your weapons. Yamamoto never met Willoughby. The two men probably never even knew each other's names. But the Japanese admiral had learned the crucial lesson from Taranto that one innovative modification could turn an impossible mission into a devastating success. Willoughby's banned trick hadn't just sunk 3 Italian battleships. It had provided the blueprint for the attack that brought America into World War II. By February 1942, Willoughby's modifications were no longer banned. They were standard. The Admiralty quietly issued Technical Directive 447/42, which authorized shallow water torpedo modifications for all Fleet Air Arm squadrons. The directive didn't mention Willoughby by name, and it certainly didn't apologize for the months of bureaucratic resistance. It simply stated that wooden stabilizing assemblies and duplex magnetic pistols were approved for combat operations in littoral environments. What had been grounds for court-martial 16 months earlier was now official Royal Navy doctrine. The impact rippled far beyond Taranto. Every major naval power studied the attack and drew their own conclusions. The Americans, shocked into the war by Pearl Harbor, immediately began developing their own shallow water torpedo modifications. The Mark XIII aerial torpedo, which had been a disaster in early Pacific battles, received wooden shroud rings and drag plates similar to Willoughby's design. By mid-1943, American torpedo bombers were using these modified weapons with devastating effectiveness at places like the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where they sank 8 Japanese transports in a single afternoon. The Soviet Navy, which had struggled with torpedo reliability throughout the war, received technical assistance from Britain in 1943 that included Willoughby's modification specifications. Soviet engineers adapted the principles to their 45-36 AV aerial torpedoes, allowing their aging I-16 and I-153 biplanes to attack German ships in the shallow Baltic Sea, with success rates that had been unthinkable in 1941. A weapons innovation born in Portsmouth was now being used from the Arctic Circle to the South Pacific. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. Willoughby had proven that complex problems sometimes had simple solutions, and that expertise could be wrong. The establishment had said shallow water torpedo attacks were impossible. They'd pointed to physics to test data, to the collective wisdom of naval engineers. They'd been wrong, not because their physics was bad, but because they'd stopped asking questions. They'd accepted limits that one stubborn mechanic refused to accept. This mindset shift affected weapons development throughout the rest of the war. When British scientists said radar-guided bombs were impossible with current technology, engineers kept trying anyway and developed the first precision-guided weapons. When aeronautical experts said jet engines would never be reliable enough for combat, aircraft designers kept experimenting and produced the Gloucester Meteor. The pattern repeated across dozens of technologies. Someone said it couldn't be done. Someone else ignored them and did it anyway. The human cost is harder to calculate but worth considering. At Taranto, 2 British aircrew died. Without Willoughby's modifications, the attack would have required close-range approaches that probably would have cost 10 or 15 aircraft instead of 2. That's 26 lives saved in a single operation. Multiply that across every shallow water torpedo attack from 1940 to 1945, hundreds of missions in the Mediterranean, Pacific, and Atlantic, and you're looking at thousands of aircrew who survived battles they would have otherwise died in. Thousands of men who went home after the war had families built lives because one mechanic figured out how to attach wooden fins to a torpedo. Willoughby himself never received public recognition during the war. Security classifications kept his work secret, and the Royal Navy's institutional embarrassment about initially rejecting his ideas meant they weren't eager to publicize the story. He was promoted to captain in 1943 and spent the rest of the war at HMS Vernon continuing to develop torpedo improvements. After the war, he retired quietly to Southampton, worked as a marine engineering consultant, and died in 1967. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his naval service, but said nothing about Taranto, nothing about wooden fins, nothing about changing the course of naval warfare. The official recognition came later after classification periods expired, and historians started digging through wartime records. In the 1,980 seconds, naval researchers finally connected the dots between Willoughby's modification work and the Taranto success. Academic papers were written. His contributions were acknowledged in official Royal Navy histories. It was the kind of recognition that comes too late to matter to the person receiving it, but serves as a reminder to everyone else. The lesson isn't really about torpedoes or wooden fins or even the brutal calculations of World War II. It's about the audacious distance between impossible and done. Someone tells you the physics don't work, the regulations forbid it. The experts, with all their accumulated wisdom and data, have already dismissed that approach. Sometimes, yes, they're right. Sometimes they're protecting you from genuinely bad ideas from reckless folly. But sometimes, rarely terrifyingly yet importantly, they're just wrong. They're not protecting you. They're protecting assumptions. They're defending expertise that has calcified into dogma, mistaking established limits for unchangeable truths. Willoughby's trick wasn't really banned because it was dangerous. It was banned because it was embarrassing. It suggested that 2 decades of painstaking torpedo development had overlooked something blindingly obvious, that a humble mechanic with access to a woodshop could outthink rooms full of brilliant engineers. The professional embarrassment, the blow to institutional pride, was worse than the risk of clinging to an impossible doctrine. So the innovation was labelled unauthorized and swept under the rug. It took a desperate strategic situation with Britain facing strangulation and defeat, and a couple of admirals, Cunningham and Lister, willing to bet their careers, even their lives, to pry that innovation from a workshop in Portsmouth to the skies over Taranto. Think about the human cost at Taranto. Only 2 British aircrew died. Without Willoughby's modifications, that attack, if it even happened, would have been a massacre costing 10 or 15 aircraft, dozens of young lives. Multiply that across the hundreds of shallow water torpedo attacks in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, the Atlantic from 1940 to 1945, and you're looking at thousands of aircrew who survived battles they would otherwise perished in. Thousands of men who went home after the war, who built families, who lived full lives, all because one mechanic refused to accept impossible. Willoughby himself never saw public recognition during the war. His work was classified, his genius quietly absorbed by the system that had initially rejected him. He retired, lived a quiet life, and died without fanfare. But his legacy, it's etched into the hulls of sunken battleships, whispered in the strategic corridors of naval history, and thundered in the skies over Pearl Harbor. So the next time someone tells you something can't be done, remember Freddy Willoughby. Remember the cardboard and wooden fins. Remember that sometimes the greatest leaps forward don't come from brilliant committees, but from the stubborn, audacious spirit of one person who dares to ask, what if? This is a story that reminds us to challenge the dogma, to question the experts, and to never ever let impossible be the final word. What an incredible story of innovation against all odds.